Howdy. How are we doing? How are we doing, boys? Okay. What do we have on the docket for today? Okay. So we're going to start off with something I saw a while ago, I've been thinking about for quite some time. I mentioned this last stream that I made a video about Second Thought, and he did a video on whether the US is a meritocracy or not. Him being a socialist, he said it is not. Hassan and Bosch agree. I disagree. If anyone wants to debate me about that, I would love to hear it. But this is not about meritocracy. This is about Second Thought's video. Is capitalism actually efficient? People are asking. Okay. So he made a video, is capitalism actually efficient? He's a socialist, so I think we know what the answer he wants to give, and it's a no. And a little funny, as a socialist starts off with an advertisement. We love to see that. So before we start the video, there's some things I kind of want to plant the seed in your guys' mind. Is efficient. What does it mean? But like, what does it really mean? What are you trying to do when we say something is efficient or inefficient? We're saying something is efficient compared to something else. If there's only one process in all of the world that process is both the most efficient and least efficient process in the world because it's the only process. So when we're talking about efficient, that's a comparative term. Nothing is just absolutely efficient. Nothing is absolutely inefficient. It's similar to saying, like, hey, this table is small. But small compared to what? Small to some other desk, that desk, my bed, this chair. What are we talking about? And in this video, Second Thought's talking about capitalism, but he never really brings up a comparative system to say this system's efficient, this system's inefficient. Implicitly, he's talking about, or he's trying to compare capitalism to socialism, even though he never really states such. But in this video, he needs to do some kind of comparison, which he never does. Or he never does it explicitly. He kind of just expects you to pick up on certain things that are inefficient, that are kind of obviously so, where he's not so much talking about capitalism as a whole. He's sort of talking about, niche systems. I shouldn't even say niche systems, but just like certain businesses or certain institutions we have, such as grocery stores or Amazon. But let's dive in, shall we?
Nebula, the streaming platform built by all your favorite YouTubers. When you sign up for Curiosity Stream,
as a link below. Starts off with an advertisement.
If you live in what's commonly called the Western world, especially in the United States, you've no doubt heard the claim that capitalism is the most efficient system for the distribution of products, and that this is thanks to the miracle of the free market, a completely organic system by which the true value of goods and services are determined. As I've mentioned in recent videos, American faith in the economic structure of capitalism is on the decline, but arguments for the effectiveness of the system are still very common. In this episode, we're going to take a look at one
and also another seed to plant for you guys. What Second Thought really is trying to get at in this video is that there are certain things that he values as a socialist, like every person should have a certain amount of food, education, housing, whatever. They should have that no matter what. But that's not really a discussion about efficiency. That's more of a discussion about effectiveness, just to put that out there. So he's not really even talking about, is capitalism efficient? He's more talking about, is capitalism effective at accomplishing the goals that I want it to accomplish? But I digress. Let's move forward.
One of the more common ones, the assertion that capitalism is efficient. Let's start with that word. Efficient. What is efficiency? The dictionary definition is effective operation as measured by a comparison of production with cost, as in energy, time, and money. The capitalist understanding of that definition is where we get into trouble. Capitalism is driven by the profit motive, the pursuit of ever greater financial gain regardless of actual economic performance. With that vision in mind, efficiency can be defined as making the smallest possible investment or expending the least amount of energy or resources to ensure increasing profits and minimum acceptable function or quality.
So, already kind of off at we're already off on the wrong foot. So what he's talking about here isn't really efficient. It's more of it's like a mashup of maximizing ROI, which is return on investment, and efficiency. This doesn't really have, because he's kind of giving it a goal. He's loading the question, as you could say. This isn't really efficient in capital. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you're just talking about just efficiency.
This capitalist translation of efficiency causes some serious problems, which we'll explore later. But first, we need to address some misconceptions espoused by the type of person who tends to claim capitalism is efficient. First and foremost, there is a common misconception that capitalism is defined by markets. That if a system has markets, it's capitalism. That is not the case. Take feudalism, for example.
Okay, so he's about to do this kind of weird thing where he's introducing feudalism, and he's doing that because of this article from Richard D. Wolff, who's a socialist, essentially just saying that markets don't dictate capitalism. Because Richard Wolff's big thing is the Marxist analysis, where we had the slave and master, serf and lord, employer, employee, and then I think in socialism there'd be no alienation or whatever. Everyone's equal in terms of the mode of production. And this is kind of, we never really get a clear definition from Second Thought. He'll do some like outlining straw men kind of a thing, where he'll say like, these things can happen under socialism or have been known to happen under capitalism, but it's not really a good, he never really fleshes out the idea. But he's going to talk about feudalism here, which is pretty weird. And I think a big part of what he's doing here, because he mentions it later, where he's almost trying to say like feudalism is better than capitalism, which is a wild claim from a socialist, from anyone really, unless you're unironically pro-feudalism, which I can't imagine anyone is unless you're guaranteed to be a lord or something. And even then, I think a lot of people would have an issue with the morality of that position in society.
As a system that existed well before the birth of capitalism, it cannot be claimed that feudalism was capitalist. And yet feudalism had markets. Serfs produced goods, which they handed over to their lords, and which those lords then sold in markets. Sometimes even the serfs had access to markets. Okay, but if capitalism isn't defined by markets, if markets existed long before capitalism, what does define it? Opinions can vary, but if you ask me, I would say capitalism is defined by 3 core philosophies. First,
okay, so nice little train system he's got, or he's about to go way off the rails. But I think we need a moment to understand kind of what just happened. He explained a popular misconception, but not really. And I think he's so socialism brained to bring up the markets thing. And I think he's just talking about people's relation to markets. And I don't really think that's coherent unless you're talking about, because the only place there's really not going to be markets, honestly, there will always be markets. Really about more like freer markets or less free markets. Like in a command economy, there's going to be very, very controlled markets that no one can take part in. If you were to take part in it, you'd be profiting. You would likely be profiting in some way. Because why else would you take part in the market if you weren't going to make a profit off it in some way? Or it has to be worth your while. You're not going to be doing exchanges that are always going to be at your detriment. And so now he's going to try to set up the 3 core philosophies of capitalism, but I'm going to warn you ahead of time. This is highly biased in kind of how he sees capitalism. He's not really giving it a fair shake.
But if you ask me, I would say capitalism is defined by 3 core philosophies. First, the drive for short-term profits over long-term stability. Second,
okay, and I think I'm going to stop at each one of these 3 points. I'm going to stop with this first one. So he's talking about the drive for short-term profits over long-term stability. But what's the longest surviving socialist country, society we have in the world? It'd have to be like Cuba or North Korea, right? The USSR collapsed. That's how unstable they were. The whole system fell apart. China, how do I want to say this, reformed their way out of socialism. I don't think you can call them socialist anymore. After, I forget his name, after Mao, the guy who came after him, implemented a lot of experimental economic or capitalist zones, and now they kind of applied that to the rest of the country. The Chinese government's obviously still heavily involved in the economic system, in business, investments, and all that kind of stuff, but from 50 years ago, they've become less and less so involved in the economy, allowing for more and more private enterprise.
the rigid stratification of the owner class and the working class.
And then the second point, the rigid stratification of the owner class and the working class. I kind of have to wonder, because again, he's using the word rigid here, which again is a comparative term, like efficient. If there's only one substance in the world, it's the most rigid and least rigid substance in the world, right? So what is he comparing this to? Because in the USSR, it was really hard to get into the central bureaucracy. That was a very rigid stratification, and it was definitely a lot more dope to be in the bureaucracy than it was to be just a regular worker in that society. And then again, since he brought up feudalism earlier, I almost have to think he's doing a callback to that, because if you were not born in the aristocracy, you were very, very unlikely to get into the aristocracy if it weren't. I mean, in most cases, it'd probably be impossible because you have to be born in the aristocracy to be an aristocrat.
And third, a devotion to imperialist expansion and infinite growth.
Okay, so that's his third point, a devotion to imperialist expansion and infinite growth. And I think he's, for the most part, talking about, so it's kind of 2 points, devotion to imperialist expansion. I have to kind of wonder, what is he talking, and I assume he has to be referring to America. And like, what is he talking, like, what lands has America taken over for its benefit? I mean, are you going to say Iraq, Afghanistan? Was that really imperialist? Because I think a lot of people in Afghanistan, it was really a mixed bag for the Afghanis. Because I think a lot of people, especially in Kabul, preferred the Americans being there because they got a real glimpse into liberalism and the freedoms they could have under their system. They don't have to live under militant Islamic fundamentalism. But in the last 20 years, where has America done imperialism through military force? And unless you're just talking about economic imperialism, which I think in that you're going to get into trouble because then China does that. Really, any country that has this, the sufficient resources to do so is going to be looking outside their country for business opportunities, for economic opportunities. And the infinite growth thing, yeah, I guess I can give them that. It's not really predicated on that, though, because I think we have to recognize that a main reason why the USSR collapsed is because they stopped growing. Their economy slowed way, way down, and that's what led to their collapse. So I just have to wonder how he's viewing this and what system could you expect where the economy's not going to be growing, where things aren't going to where systems aren't going to become more efficient, keyword there, because otherwise I just I hear this all the time from socialists online, and I understand that capitalism is kind of predicated on, continuous growth, but it's not necessarily growth where you need more and more resources, just more growth and like you're becoming more and more efficient or effective, where you could have a system that's just that's I think medicine is a good idea. Like vaccines are really efficient because you could avoid the disease altogether and not have to go through any treatment, which can usually be costly financially or even to your health. But okay, so we're getting worse and worse. So these were his 3 philosophies of capitalism as defined by Second Thought. Not great.
As socialists have correctly pointed out for well over a century, the tendencies of capitalism do not lend themselves to market efficiency.
So now he's going to describe 3 other characteristics of capitalism. And who wants to take a guess if these will be good faith criticisms or they'll kind of be like the straw men of how socialists view capitalism?
But rather towards military oppression of foreign populations, over-exploitation of workers and natural resources, and increasingly frequent economic crises.
Okay, and so he said capitalism, they trends towards military oppression of foreign populations, and where is that happening with America? Who are we militarily oppressing? I don't think we were militarily oppressing the Afghans, for example. I think a lot of Afghans were really upset when we left because that meant the Taliban were going to come in and they were going to do some real military oppression. And they are doing really real military oppression. But my biggest contention with this point is this only capitalism? Does only capitalist countries do military oppression? Because let's not forget, communist China took over Tibet. They also invaded Vietnam. So they weren't capitalists. How were they, invading countries that weren't theirs without a profit incentive? Somehow they were doing it. And the over-exploitation of workers and natural resources, I don't really know I think he needs to do a better job of what does that even mean to over-exploit workers and natural resources, because, China had sweatshops for a long time when they were more socialist, And now that they've become more capitalist, and their economy's improved and grown and gotten better, they're having less and less of people who have to work in sweatshops to make a good living. And the increasingly frequent economic crises is also kind of funny because I guess you could say the USSR didn't have many economic crises because it had one and then it ceased to exist. So I think I'd prefer the system that can have an economic crisis and it won't collapse the society.
All of these observations have proven their accuracy many times over. Capitalism relies on the exploitation of workers at home and abroad.
And so, let's just keep in mind thus far, we haven't really been discussing efficiency. Because when I first saw this video, when I first saw its title, and I didn't actually think this, but you know what I mean, where I would have thought if I didn't know second thought and I saw this video, I thought it would have been an analysis between socialism and capitalism, or capitalism and socialism, whatever, because he's trying to see if capitalism is actually efficient. And as we're already 3 minutes into this, and pretty soon he's going to transition out of his arguments and kind of go into like these or his macro argument and go to these micro cases. I don't think really answer the question either. I think he's kind of just answering these specific companies are inefficient in these certain ways. But so far, he's not really doing any kind of analysis to answer the question, is capitalism actually efficient? So what's going on here? Because you have to compare capitalism to something to discern whether it's more efficient or less efficient, or compare capitalism to itself in a different time period to confirm if it's getting less or more efficient. And I think most people would agree it's getting more efficient because our processes are getting less wasteful. Obviously, there's always going to be some kind of waste because no system's ever perfect. You're never going to get 100% yield, 100% empirical yield. You're always going to have some level of waste. It's just inevitable because humans, we're imperfect. Any system we create is going to have failures. It's going to have inefficiencies because people in themselves are imperfect and inefficient to some degree. And he's sort of setting up this capitalism. He's just trying to like frame everything through that as it being this wholly malignant system with no benefits. I mean, he even brought up feudalism and made feudalism sound like it's not that bad, and then brings it to capitalism, and he'll bring up feudalism again, where he mentions how they had a benefit in feudalism that we don't even have in capitalism. It's just so strange that people can watch this and go, "Wow, this guy is right on the money." I think for the most part, this is meant for audiences of people. This is meant for a socialist audience, so he's not going to say anything. Nothing in here is stuff that anyone who's a socialist is going to disagree with because they want to agree with this. And he's not really trying to empirically answer the question, is capitalism actually more efficient? And what he's really trending towards, and he'll get into it, is capitalism effective at accomplishing the goals I think it should accomplish? Which doesn't really have anything to do with efficiency.
And this working class is entirely at the mercy of those who own the companies which put them to work. In reality, these workers are often more excluded from capitalist markets than even feudal serfs, because the modern...
And so there it was. He says the modern workers in capitalist systems are... What's his exact wording? Excluded from capitalist markets are more excluded from capitalist markets than even feudal serfs, which... This is just insane to me. Because let's think about this. Let's slow down for a second. So I can understand how someone can jump at that idea and say like, yeah, of course. But anyone, I'm talking about mostly Americans. If you have a smartphone, you can go on eBay, Etsy, Facebook Marketplace, and you can sell and buy stuff on that market, on that free market. No one's telling you you have to buy things at this certain price or sell things at this certain price. You can go on there and sell and buy, for the most part, I think, whatever you want. I'm sure there's some restrictions. I'm not entirely sure. Like if it's illegal or something, I'm guaranteed you can't. And those things probably should be illegal for certain for particular reasons because they might be dangerous or whatever. But and you can also trade with your neighbors. Unless you live in the middle of nowhere where you don't have neighbors, there's nothing stopping me from going to my neighbors and offering them some kind of transaction. Like, hey, I'll sell you my couch. You give me $100 or something like that. Nothing's stopping me from doing that. And he's not even really, I don't think he even views labor markets as a capitalist market. You get to choose where you work. There might not be all the options you want, or the conditions might not be exactly what you want, but you do have an option. These people probably don't have to work in, I assume this is like a sausage factory. They could probably go work somewhere else, but they chose to work here, probably because this employer offered the best conditions for them to work.
An worker does not own any of the goods or services they produce. Okay, why does that matter? It matters because if the...
And then he also kind of overlooks, so a business can hire you, a capitalist can hire you, so they're going to give you money for your labor, and you're going to get paid for that labor no matter what. You could be doing wholly useless stuff, and you'll still get paid for your labor. However, if you were to, I don't know, be a serf and grow some corn in your backyard and try to sell that corn and no one wants to buy that corn, your labor just got wasted because that corn's going to go bad. And if no one buys it, you're going to go, except for all the corn you can eat, you're not going to get paid for the full amount in your labor, because if that corn goes to waste, you just spent a lot of your labor getting all this corn that you didn't get a full return on. You wasted a lot of labor on the corn that went rotten or unsold. But he obviously, as a socialist, he's reluctant to bring up that fact.
The workers are excluded from the market system. That means only a tiny minority of wealthy and powerful people, the owner class, has access to the so-called free market. But the selling of products on the market is only half the equation. The other half is production. Similar to the sale of products by the owner class, the production of those products is also controlled by the wealthy and powerful. Those who own the means of production, a factory, a pharmaceutical lab, a supermarket chain, decide what is produced, how it is produced, when it is produced, and so on. These people, who do not perform any of the actual labor, dictate the terms to those who do. And when the demanded products are finished, they own them. In this way, the owner class, the capitalists, have complete control of the free market system, from production to sale. Okay, but that's just the creation and sale of the actual products, right? Doesn't the free market still determine the final price and dictate how and what companies produce? Misguided defenders of capitalism will say, of course, the market is beholden to the law of supply and demand. Companies have to produce what the market demands, or they won't make a profit. This belief in a supposed economic law is not reflected in reality.
So, just kind of a crazy thing to say. Because it's almost like he's saying that all markets are just wholly fabricated or wholly manipulated. But that's just obviously not true. Because what are you going to buy, the cheaper coffee maker or the more expensive coffee maker, assuming that their qualities are similar? Probably going to choose the cheaper coffee maker. But I almost wonder, I really wish he fleshed out this part more, because I just have to wonder, like, how are you so, like, what propaganda are you reading to believe supply and demand just absolutely don't matter? They mean nothing. And he's going to talk about it a little bit, but he just doesn't really answer this question, because he kind of just brings up this conspiracy of everything that's for sale is, like, marked up, or, you know what I mean? Like, you can't get a better offer. You can only get this one choice, and that's just not how it works. Like, for this to work, all the capitalists in the world would have to be colluding and not competing with each other, and they're just trying to, you sell it for that price, and then I'll match your price, and then the consumers won't have a choice in it. They'll just have to buy one of these, so we'll both make a profit. And that's just obviously not how it works. Like, why else would oil fluctuate the way it does?
Everything else under capitalism, supply and demand is manipulated by those with money and power. Let's look at one recent example.
This is one of Amazon's big...
And so he's kind of done with the meat and potatoes of his... So that was kind of the macro setup. And so now we're going to go into this micro case analysis in which it's much more of an emotional appeal. Obviously, this whole thing, there's like really no analytics. It's kind of, he's going to bring up these one-offs examples, which, I mean, for the most part, I agree with this. This isn't good, a lot of things he brings up. It is very wasteful. It seems inefficient, not good. But I would say I would have a hard time believing if someone was not a socialist up to this point, if you had any kind of economic literacy, I would hope that you would be wholly unconvinced by his analysis thus far of capitalism. Not that there's even really been an analysis. It's been kind of just rhetoric about how he feels about capitalism. And a lot of it, I think, doesn't really hold out in the real world.
biggest UK warehouses in Dunfermline, Scotland. And from inside where millions of perfectly good products each year are sent to be destroyed.
Speed this up.
Secret footage captured in what's known as the destruction zone, and that calls into question the company's environmental and ethical practices. An ITV News investigation reveals unsold laptops scanned not for delivery, but instead marked destroyed. Boxes full of electrical items, such as drills, shavers, headphones, even smart TVs. The list goes on. Brand new books still in their wrappers, or jewellery or steel cutlery, with that same instruction: destroy. One former employee, who wishes to remain anonymous, reveals the scale of what they're asked to do.
So from a Friday to a Friday, our target was approximately 130,000 items a week.
The target to destroy from one centre was 130,000 items.
Yes, there's no rhyme or reason to what gets destroyed. Dyson fans, Hoovers, the occasional MacBook or iPad. Or the other day, 20 bins filled with thousands of COVID masks still in their plastic wrappers.
Separately, we followed another lorry as it headed out, carrying non-electrical items. The destination, a landfill and recycling site, only a few miles from where they'd been stored, and in the main, still perfectly usable.
What's going on here? Why are these items being destroyed? The answer is simple. It makes Amazon more money to dump perfectly good laptops, TVs, and silverware into a landfill as opposed to selling it at a loss or donating it to charity.
And so, at this part, I agree with him. But I think he has to be honest here and, admit that if Amazon were to eat those costs, everything else they offer would have to increase to offset those costs. And again, every system's going to be inefficient. I don't agree with the way Amazon does this, and I can assure you they're probably doing their best to alleviate this, because this is obviously inefficient on its face, where you're buying something and you're not selling it for a positive ROI. You're not going to be in business. The bigger proportion of your business or of your stock that ends up going to waste is only going to hurt you. But this is a classic issue of distributors and middlemen, where Amazon really is just a marketplace where it's a middleman and a distributor, where they're buying all this stock up front from different companies. They're taking it to their warehouse, which is hopefully they've calculated it to be a central location, which they can easily deliver from to a bunch of localities. And sometimes it doesn't work out. And I think it's unfortunate that they don't do a better job of cutting down this waste, but I can assure you they are trying to cut down the waste. Also, something missing from this analysis is what's the proportion of the things that they're trashing, that they're sending to waste, is what's the proportion of that waste to their entire operation of the stock they sell? I would bet actually, that it is a tiny minority. Otherwise, someone else would outcompete Amazon easily if they're really being that wasteful.
Too much product availability drives prices down, and it's more profitable to keep demand high by artificially limiting product availability. When there's no demand for a product on the market, companies destroy their stock to create fake demand. Take car companies, for example. When a new model is coming out, the old ones quietly disappear. They haven't all been bought. The ones they can't.
Also, I don't know how true this is. Because I don't think you can always buy an older model of a car. And cars have a huge amount of capital that go into them. Like if every year they had to get rid of this many cars and it was a significant portion of all the cars they produced, they would probably stop making those cars. Ford did this not too long ago. They canceled the Ford Focus, the Fiesta, I think the Pinto, and the Taurus because people just weren't buying them in the quantities they needed to sustain their assembly line for those models. And I guarantee you, like I almost bet that this picture is from a model that got recalled. That had some defect that would have been too costly to fix to make these worth selling, where they would already be at a loss, where it's better to just scrap them.
Sell to rental companies have been destroyed. Same with Amazon and their mountains of unopened PPE. Mask use is dropping, so in order to maintain profitable prices, they simply destroy excess stock. And by destroy, I mean dump truckloads of non-biodegradable waste in landfills, where it will remain forever, further polluting the planet for the sake of short-term profits. And it's not just consumer goods either. Look at the food industry. During the pandemic, American dairy farmers dumped 3.7 million gallons of milk per day, and potato farmers destroyed 1.5 billion tons of their crop. Why? Because it wouldn't be profitable to find ways to give it all away. To their credit, some potato farmers put out a call to have anyone come and take as many potatoes as they wanted, which is certainly better than nothing. But the fact that we have exactly zero infrastructure in place for the emergency distribution of food products is a damning indictment of the soulless, for-profit capitalist system. And farmers aren't even close to the worst offenders. You've probably seen the video of the young Dunkin' Donuts worker who...
And so, I think it's interesting because one obvious solution to this is if there was just shortages. If they purposely undershot demand, they'd probably sell almost everything. They would assuredly cut down on the amount of waste. And would that be a better system? Are you ever going to get you're never going to get exactly demand and sell everything perfectly. You know, you're not going to sell the last thing and then there's literally no one else who wants to buy that thing for how much it costs to, you know, create, design, whatever, bring to market. That's a fantasy world. And food is a great example of that because food goes bad. So you need to continuously always be producing more, and you probably always want to overproduce it.
Who, instead of throwing away excess donuts according to company policy, bagged them up and donated them to the homeless and his local firefighters.
Yeah, and I think it would be better if Dunkin' Donuts allowed them to do that. That would be way cooler. Especially, yeah, just giving them the homeless people or firefighters or whatever, or the police. I think that'd be an ideal situation for everyone.
For this act of kindness, which cost the company nothing, this person was fired. Let's do a little napkin math. It's not uncommon for a single Dunkin' Donuts store to throw away 5 dozen donuts or more per night. That's 60 donuts. As of June 1st, 2021, there are 9,291 Dunkin' Donuts locations in the US. If we figure 60 donuts per store per night, that's 557,460 donuts every night.
And again, they could just produce a shortage, so they would guarantee they sold everything, but a lot of people wouldn't be able to get what they want. Because there's always going to be that balance between not trying to have a shortage and not trying to overproduce too much. Obviously, it's not that easy. Obviously, Dunkin' Donuts doesn't want to produce all these things that they're just going to waste. Obviously, Amazon doesn't want to buy all these things that they're just going to waste. These companies are always trying to basically always discover what demand is in their particular market or whatever particular market and probably produce enough stock to be just above that demand, just in case. And obviously, they overshoot sometimes.
203 million donuts per year. 4 billion pounds of donuts just thrown away. Okay, but donuts are junk food. It's not like they're keeping healthy meals from people. Well, let's look at grocery stores. Grocery stores throw away over 43 billion pounds of food every year. And that's not just expired food. According to a recent study, a full 50% of the discarded food is still perfectly edible when it's thrown away. This is an unconscionable practice when over 23 million Americans are food insecure.
Okay, so I actually looked into this one. Anyone want to guess? Because most of the food we're seeing here is perishable. Why they can't just donate it? It's because a lot of places that take food donations, they don't want food that goes bad. They want non-perishable goods. Because the grocery store is going to keep this food until it's close to expiration or past expiration. So them donating it to these food banks or whatever, they're going to have to, those food banks essentially are going to have to turn this food over to people who need it or whatever as quick, like almost instantaneously, because they can't hold it for very long because then it'll all go bad. And a lot of this food needs to be refrigerated, which also has its own cost, unlike perishable canned goods. So it's not so easy as just let other people get this food, because it's going to go bad. And obviously the grocery stores don't want to be doing this. And I can guarantee you, just like Amazon or Dunkin' Donuts, they're trying their very best to buy or have enough stock to be just above demand so they can minimize their waste as much as possible. Obviously, we live in an unpredictable world.
To further hammer home the dystopian nature of our for-profit system, during the pandemic, we saw armed guards blocking people from retrieving food from dumpsters outside grocery stores.
And so the reason this is because if you just let people go into your garbage to take out food, one, it's probably close to spoiling, or it is spoiled. And two, there's going to be a big mess to clean up afterwards. Because I guarantee you, a lot of that food's going to be dropped, stepped on, whatever. It's going to make a mess. And who's to clean it up? The workers at the grocery store. And I guarantee you, those workers don't want to clean up food that is rotting and spoiling.
Think about that for a minute. People are desperate enough to dig food out of a dumpster during the worst pandemic in our lifetime. And those in power decide not to help distribute food, but to defend our corporate waste with the threat of violence. The US is not the only country at fault here. Other capitalist nations act similarly. We produce enough food to feed every human on Earth, with plenty to spare. But the inherent traits of capitalism disincentivize a common-sense allocation of resources in favor of maximizing profit. These tendencies, the tendencies to cut corners, generate tons of waste, and neglect long-term stability, exist in every sector. We've recently seen the consequences of supposed capitalist efficiency in my home state of Texas.
Okay, so this is where I think he oversteps. Because I think he was feeling pretty jigged up about the course he was going. And as I said before, he's not really talking about efficiency. He's more talking about how capitalism isn't effective in accomplishing the goals it wants. And I think in this case, he really demonstrates that. It's undeniable.
And in Florida. During last winter's cold snap, millions of Texans were left without power or clean drinking water, many for days or even weeks on end. This was the direct result of the reckless privatization of our electrical grid. In order to cut costs and maximize profits, ERCOT neglected to weatherproof our electrical infrastructure. The result was catastrophic, and future failures will only get worse as the effects of climate change intensify. Florida is another prime candidate.
Okay, so he's right that Texas's energy market, electricity grid, is unregulated. But what he neglected to mention is that for years, the benefits of Texas' deregulated market structure were clear. At 8.6 cents per kilowatt hour, the state's average retail price for electricity was around 1/5 lower than the national average and about half the cost of California's. That sounds pretty efficient to me. But in that one case where there was a cold snap and the gear in the grid wasn't winterized, it failed, which caused issues. Before that, it was very efficient. It was cheaper. It was half the cost of California's. That sounds efficient to me, but it wasn't very effective at handling the winter cold snap that the grid was not meant to handle. And so that right there should just be the perfect analysis of how flawed second thought's analysis of is capitalism actually efficient.
It for truly dystopian climate fallout. As we speak, the Florida coast is becoming increasingly unsafe thanks to erosion and rising sea levels. And yet luxury accommodations continue to spring up all over Miami. On June 24th, Champlain Towers South, a condo building in Surfside, collapsed, killing an as yet undetermined number of people, likely over 100. For years, the developers had known about critical flaws in the integrity of the building, which would have cost them an estimated $9 million to rectify. Common sense and a concern for safety would have prompted them to make the repairs.
Okay. I don't love his use of common sense there. A real conservative argument, but beyond that. So this was a big tragedy. This was horrible. And agreed that the capitalists or the landowners of this, whoever owned this, they messed up. They messed up real big. And they ended up paying out, I think it was, doesn't matter, I can't find it. They ended up paying out like $1 billion. $1.02 billion. The families affected by this. And so, from the perspective of the landowners, the people who own this, they were not being efficient. They took a risk. That was not good. I think we can all agree that was really, really not good. And this is really more a failure of regulation. And there have been regulation updates since this tragedy that hopefully will prevent things like this happening.
The profit motive disincentivized that action, and no repairs were made. The end result was the entirely preventable collapse of a 13-story building and the loss of dozens of innocent lives. Florida is one of the more obvious cases of at-risk infrastructure, but the rest of the country isn't far behind. The Pacific Northwest has been experiencing temperatures never before seen in that region, the heat literally melting electrical wires and buckling roads. The efficient thing to do would be to invest the money to repair and weatherproof our infrastructure, thereby preventing future shipping shutdowns, traffic problems, and catastrophic failures like bridge collapses. The capitalist notion of efficiency will result in us doing the absolute bare minimum to restore the lowest possible level of adequate function to maintain our precarious operation.
But then you have to think, should we not weatherize all the grids in the country? Should we not weatherize Hawaii's grid? Even though they'll probably never need it? I would argue that'd be inefficient, but it seems like, for second thought, that would be efficient to do that, even though they'll likely never ever need a winterized grid in Hawaii. And so this is kind of, again, how he's really trying to sneak in effective for his goals and equating that to be efficient, and it's just not the case. There's obviously going to always be these trade-offs, and the future is always uncertain, so you have to really judge, is this worth the investment? Even in a socialist society, we're going to be making those calculations. You're not going to just be winterizing Hawaii's grid because they're probably never going to need it. They don't even have winter in Hawaii. So would it be worth the cost when that would it be worth the resources to winterize Hawaii's grid when those resources could be spent in other places for problems that are much more immediate? That's kind of the issue here. It's very easy to point at failures and say, how could no one ever prevent this? But that's the nature of disasters. No one thinks those disasters are certain, and so you're always trying to hedge your bet and, maximize your ROI. Like you said, it's just, I don't know. It's just dishonest in my opinion.
So, what are the takeaways here? Capitalism's vision of efficiency is predicated not on ensuring the long-term function or sustainability of our systems, or the common-sense allocation of resources, labor, or products, but on minimizing costs and maximizing profits. Efficiency is just a euphemism for cost-cutting, destructive, wasteful practices, short-sightedness, and criminal negligence. It removes the human factor from the equation and centers capital instead. Actual efficiency has to take into account the longevity of systems and the sustainability of practices and products. It's not efficient to overproduce and then dump millions of tons of unopened products into landfills.
Is it efficient, though, to underproduce? And some people go hungry? Would that be more efficient? I guess you could argue it's more efficient, but it's not better.
It's tremendously wasteful. It takes labor power, raw materials, and carbon emissions to produce those goods, which are then discarded and add to the ever-increasing human toll on the environment. It's not efficient to let mountains of perfectly good food rot in dumpsters when millions of Americans don't have enough to eat. Even if you take a capitalist approach, wouldn't it make more sense to ensure that your workers are properly nourished so that they can work at full performance? What about making accommodations for future pandemics or other crises? It will be much more expensive to come up with emergency distribution methods during a crisis than to plan ahead and implement those systems slowly. Same with infrastructure. It's not efficient to build high-rises that will collapse into the sea in 10 years.
I mean, who's to say, though? What if that building can get a positive return over those 10 years? Wouldn't that be better? When you want more housing stock, less homeless people, wouldn't that be better? That'd be efficient. That'd be an efficient allocation of resources.
Or to neglect weatherizing electrical grids.
Because then you could always just push that out until forever. Like, should we build a house here, even though in 100 years it's gonna rot or whatever, and then you'll have to build a new house? Like, yeah, obviously we have to use the resources as best we can that are out in front of us. Obviously, we can't perfectly know when something's gonna go wrong, but we have to try our best. And we should try our best. Like, that's the whole point of regulation.
It's roads or bridges. Nothing this country does is efficient in any real sense. It's wasteful, short-sighted, and inhumane. The capitalist notion of efficiency is a sham. It exists only as an excuse for the genocidal adherence to the profit motive. So no, capitalism is not the most efficient system.
And has he mentioned another system? He said not the most efficient system. The only other system he mentioned is feudalism.
It doesn't deserve to be called efficient at all. People are slowly coming around to that fact. Let's hope it doesn't take many more collapsed buildings, statewide power outages, or bread lines to put the final nail in the coffin. I mentioned climate change a number of times in this video.
Okay, and then he's gonna do another ad. Curiosity streams. Okay, but to zoom out on this, this is really why, philosophically, capitalism is more efficient. Because capitalism, we're talking about just pure capitalism, you get what you can afford. And you're able to afford those things by returning some kind of labor, product, service to other people who want that. So there's that exchange. You can make money to afford the things you want, and those people get a thing they want by paying you money. It would be inefficient if we gave everything they wanted based on the needs they had. Otherwise, there would be no reason for them to put back into the system to give back resources, to give back their labor, to give back products, to give back services to other people who have needs. So then that's just not efficient, because then you're rewarding people for just the sake of having needs. And obviously that's an unsustainable system in a vacuum. And I think the reason he never brought up socialism, and he probably wanted to, is because he knew he couldn't. And the reason this whole video was really just about effectiveness. It's not accomplishing the goals it wanted to accomplish. And he's just saying that's being efficient. Obviously that's not the case. This guy is dishonest. Yeah, you love to see it. Okay. All right, next topic. Okay. So this is something I've been thinking about for a while. And that is, what do we mean by random? I think when most people say random, or think about random, or talk about random, what they're thinking, saying, or hearing is that the outcome is unknown. But what if that's not really random? For example, if I put my hands behind my back and ask you, how many fingers am I holding up behind my back? To you, it might be random. It might come up, oh, it was 2. It was random. But is that really random? Because it wasn't random to me. I knew exactly the numbers I was picking. It wasn't random to me. It was random to you. And so I think we have to ask ourselves, what's going on there? And I think what's going on there is you can't perceive the inputs or the process that created the outcome. Because, my brain is telling me to put up this many fingers. And you can't see how many fingers I'm picking. And so it appears random to you. It's not really random. It might appear random, but it's not really random. You just can't see the inputs or processing. And another good example of this is if you were to ask people randomly on the street, give me a number between 1 and 100. Do you think you'll get an even distribution of numbers? You don't. Some numbers get a lot, some numbers don't get any, as this shows. Like you get 68 or 69. 69 was picked a lot. I wonder why that was. It's almost as if they weren't randomly picking a number. They were picking a number that they probably thought about or they enjoyed picking. And another good one is rolling a dice or flipping a coin random? I take a coin and I flip it and it lands. It's difficult to predict what it's going to land on. Or you roll a dice, it's difficult to predict what number it's going to land. But I would argue that's very similar to the fingers behind the back. In that, you can't easily observe or know the inputs or the process that takes those inputs and converts them into an output. But, for example, like in physics, you could look at a free body diagram. Say you're a computer who's able to perfectly predict. Oh my God, just open the image in a new thing. Where you're able to see the coin and see how much I flip it, you're able to calculate that for us right off the bat, right after I do it. And you knew the starting position of the coin. You'd probably be able to predict in all the other physical features that affect the coin as it's flipping through the air or whatever, and gravity and air friction, all that stuff, the weight of the coin. And you'd be able to give a perfect prediction of what it was once you saw the inputs and you understand the process perfectly. But how does this work? So, does that make sense? So, basically, randomness for us, the way we perceive it, is just anything where we can't observe or can't perfectly understand the inputs and outputs. Essentially, what I'm saying is randomness doesn't exist. And you might be thinking of computers, but even computers aren't actually random. Oh, this is the grocery. Doesn't matter. So computers, the way when you're coding or whatever and you say give me a random number, they're not really giving you a random number. What they're doing there is based on some internal process, for example, where the fan is in its cycle, and they'll say use that position as the seed number to put in the random algorithm to produce whatever random output. So it's not really random. You're just not seeing that input of the fan, and you're not able to observe that random algorithm that they take the seed number and put into the algorithm to produce that random output. Because computers can't be random. The algorithm they have to use has to be known. Some programmer has to create it. And there are some random algorithms that they won't even use things like that. They'll just use some like air pressure or temperature of the computer to give some random thing. But then it can become repeatable, because if the pressure or whatever or the temperature stay constant, you'll get the same output every time. Computers can't be random. They have to be deterministic. We have to tell it what to do, and we can make it appear random, but it's not really random. We're just giving it highly variable inputs, such as where the fan is in its cycle to act as the seed that produces that output. Because there's really infinite positions that fan could be in to generate a seed to put in an algorithm. So it appears it'll be a highly variable number, highly unpredictable number from what we're able to observe on the computer. And so I think randomness doesn't really exist. However, if randomness doesn't exist, then can free will exist? Because ultimately, what free will is randomness. Because if I'm able to understand the inputs to your brain, which would basically be your entire history, everything up into this point. Like, for example, when you asked 100 random people, or you asked whatever, some certain number of people on the street, and you asked them to give you a number between 1 and 100, a lot of them say 69. Was that free will driving them to say the number 69? Or was it some, history with that number, or some memes with that number that compelled them to choose that number? And it's probably the latter. So they're not really being random in their choice of free will. They're choosing things deterministically, even though we can't observe those inputs or their brain processes to produce that output. So I just think that's really interesting to think about, because if randomness does exist, only place I could possibly imagine it being is in our human minds. And that's impossible to predict whether that's actually random, or if it's actually just like how you can train a fly or an insect and they'll act in very certain ways if you control their inputs. You can figure out their processes and predict perfectly how they'll react and act in certain conditions with certain variables. Something to think about. All right. Well, I think that's it for me.